gospel this evening, we find Jesus in a precarious situation. He is being questioned by folks who wish to trick him. Now, we're coming up on Halloween, when kids will descend upon the streets carrying bags and shouting trick or treat as they knock on doors in search of candy. Ghosts and superheroes alike will fill the streets to engage in an innocent kind of trickery, dressed up in costume and ceremoniously demanding sweets. When I think of innocent trickery, I also think of this time when my wife tricked me during our first year of dating. We had gone on a day trip to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and we spent the afternoon ducking in and out of those little shops and cafes to stay warm, as the cool fall air had this hint of winter on it. And towards the end of the day, the sun already set, we went into this Irish jewelry shop, and I admired this cross necklace for several minutes. Then we left the shop and started to make our way back to the car. And midway back to the car, Nicole said, "Oh no, I forgot my wallet in the shop." And she sent me towards the car to get warm, and she turned back to the shop to retrieve her wallet. Later that night, when we were back in Boston, she presented me with the necklace I had so admired. She hadn't forgotten her wallet in the store after all. Instead, she had tricked me into thinking that she had, so that she could go out and do this nice thing of purchasing this necklace for me. This was a sweet kind of tricking, a tricking that used deception in service to a kind and generous outcome. So I wonder tonight, as we read this scripture about trickery, when have you been in a situation that tricked you? When have you found yourself being tricked? Tonight's scripture is in fact not about innocent trickery. It's about trickery by people with ill will, the disciples of the Pharisees and the Herodians. So I wonder, have you experienced that kind of trickery in your life? Have you been tricked by people who are actually against you? In the chapter that precedes tonight's reading, so tonight's reading came from chapter 22, and in chapter 21, of Scripture in Matthew, we see representatives from a number of Jewish leadership groups coming to Jesus with questions. It's a whole chapter of questions to Jesus. They ask him questions about his authority, they ask him questions about resurrection, they ask him questions about the law. And Jesus is, of course, no stranger to being questioned by various groups. And in tonight's scripture, he thoughtfully engages with these questioners, these Pharisees and Herodians. He engages with them despite knowing that they're out to trick him. The question that we see in tonight's scripture is brought forward by the disciples of the Pharisees and the Herodians. And this is actually a somewhat unlikely pairing. The Pharisees representing the religious groups of the day, the religious interests, and the Herodians representing the interests of King Herod. So despite being from two different groups, they band together in this shared interest, this shared effort to trick Jesus, to trap Jesus, by providing him with this lose-lose situation. There's no way to win here, as far as we can see. They begin by speaking of Jesus' integrity. They have this desire to smooth talk him by saying he's sincere and he teaches the truth and he's concerned with equity. They say all these things to Jesus, and then they pose, their big question to Jesus. They pose their big question to Jesus, and it's this: is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? The tax they are questioning him on is called the census tax. And it's a tax that would have cost 1 coin, 1 denarius in the day, per person. And after hearing this question, we find Jesus in a bit of a bind. So he's heard this question from these two groups: is it lawful to pay the taxes to the emperor or not? So if he answers yes, if he says that it is lawful to pay the taxes to the emperor, then he could be perceived as being in collusion with Rome. It might look like he was justifying Roman occupation and the oppression of the Jews, and this would be an extremely unpopular stance among the Jewish people. So it's not quite right to say that it is lawful to pay these taxes. But on the other hand, and this is why this is a lose-lose situation for Jesus, if he answers no, that it is not lawful to pay taxes to the emperor, he would be suspected of being a revolutionary in direct opposition of Rome. So how does Jesus handle this tricky situation? Well, he answers by first making clear that he is aware of the questioner's trickery. He names the situation for what he is. He calls them hypocrites, because they show something on the outside, this sweet talking of Jesus, this over-the-top flattery of Jesus, which is in fact quite the opposite of what they are truly inside, full of cruel intent to trick and trap Jesus. After calling them hypocrites, after naming the truth of the situation, Jesus then asks them to bring forward a coin, to bring forward one of these denarius, the cost of the tax in question. And so he holds up the coin and he asks those around him to come close and to identify whose image is on the coin. When they identify the emperor's face and title, Jesus delivers the one-liner that concludes this evening's scripture. He says, "Give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and give to God the things that are God's." We know that the emperor's face is chiseled into the coin, and therefore we can believe that Jesus meant to say that these coins fall under the category of things that are the emperor's. But we're left wondering about the phrase, "and to God the things that are God's." What does Jesus mean by that? What does Jesus mean by giving to God the things that are God's? Well, when we look back over the Gospel of Matthew, we see that Jesus is teaching in a variety of passages the Old Testament concept that in fact all of the things are God's. It's all God's. And friends, this is why this is a subversive text. Jesus satisfies those who wish him to say that the coin tax belongs to the emperor. He says, yes, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, but he does not fully give in to that notion. Instead, he concludes his response by saying, but give to God the things that are God's, which in Jesus' mind means everything. He is subverting this reach of this empire. He is affirming that the all-encompassing reach is God's ownership over everything. To picture even further how subversive Jesus was being in this moment, we can look at what was actually on these denarius, what was on this coin that the questioners produced for Jesus. On one side would have said this. It would have said, Tiberius Caesar, Augustus, son of the divine Augustus. And on the other side of the coin, it would have said, Pontifex Maximus, which means high priest. This coin was in fact making the bold statement, the idolatrous claim that the emperor was holy. So into this climate of imperial rule in which the emperor is seen as in fact holy, Jesus reasserts God's ownership and God's rule. Through this one-liner at the end of this passage, Jesus says that above all of this imperial rule is God's rule, more powerful and more important. So the crux of tonight's scripture is about allegiance and rule. It asks us to consider where our own allegiances lie. And it asserts that if God rules all, then we in fact belong to God alone. So this phrase, we belong to God, isn't one that you hear very often in progressive Protestant denominations. But it was one that I recall hearing from pulpits a lot when I was growing up. My mother was born in Texas, and the whole side of her family lived and still lives in Texas today. And they were born and raised Church of Christers, and they would go to their local Church of Christ for Sunday school and worship and hymn sings every Sunday. But then they would be back there on Wednesday for supper and Bible study. And if they went to college, they went to Church of Christ colleges. So I grew up attending these churches whenever we were back in Texas on a visit. And I remember marveling at the a cappella singing and being totally confused by the conservative dress. And the Church of Christ is known for its very conservative stances on social issues. And there is so much that I disagree with theologically. But in addition to phenomenal four-part harmony singing, I believe that the Church of Christ gets it right when they assert that we belong to God, and when they preach that we belong to God. There's truth in that assertion. In some ways, when we hear that phrase, that we belong to God, we might feel that it reduces our power and our own agency. However, to belong to God is to be positioned to dispel the sins of the world and to live freely. Our power and our agency is not reduced by belonging to God, rather it ultimately lies in our acknowledgement of belonging to God. Being God's beloved means being showered in grace and set free from the structures of sin. And though it can feel like a troublesome phrase in some ways, it gets at the core truth of who we have an allegiance to, who will have our allegiance, because we will belong to something in this world, and if we choose to belong to God, we can live a life of abundance. As tonight's scripture highlights, we belong to God, but we live in a world where there's all these other things that are competing to sway us and to capture our attention and our hearts. There's a tendency, for example, for what we own to exert ownership over us. We've all heard the phrase, you can't serve both God and money, and this is what this gets at. So what is it, I wonder, that is vying for your attention? What is it that's exerting ownership over you? What's asking for your allegiance in this world? So the thing that vies for my attention and which threatens to rule me the most is material stuff. And I find that I accumulate stuff at an alarming rate. I don't know how it gets into my house, but it just comes in. It walks in on its own, and it takes up residence. So several years ago, my sister Alexis picked up a copy of this Marie Kondo book called The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up, with the subtitle, The Japanese Art of Decluttering and Organizing. So I love it. It's got magic, and it's got art, and it's about decluttering and organizing. And so she quickly devoured this book, and she passed the title on to my other sister, who caught on, and they both joined this cult of followers of this magic of tidying up. And so before long, they were sending messages to this sister group that we have, and they were talking about rolling their socks in this perfect little way so that their sock drawer would provide them with harmony and joy, and I didn't know what they were talking about. And in the book, there's this core exercise. So I finally caught on to this craze, and I bought the book, I drank the Kool-Aid, and I read all about it, and I followed this core exercise, which is in an effort to purge as much material possessions as you possibly can. And in the exercise, the author asks you to pick up each item that you own and to ask the following question: does this spark joy in me? And in her ruthless, joy-seeking nature, the author declares that these items which do not spark joy ought to be gotten rid of. So as Kondo's book reached the position of #1 New York Times bestseller, there were plenty of critics, as you can imagine. People suggested that to spend so much time questioning whether or not our stuff sparked joy was in fact a royal waste of time. Others suggested that to wrap up so much emotion into material possessions was preposterous. But Marie Kondo's book gets at the root of the idea of allegiance and belonging. She is tackling head-on the joyless stuff that threatens to overtake people's day-to-day lives. She's boldly asserting that we ought not to own stuff that does not bring us joy. So for me, material possessions threaten to rule me, and they usually don't spark any joy. My stuff takes up space in my home and takes up an inordinate amount of time to maintain it, clean it, organize, and put it away. Whenever I clean my house, I have to wonder if I own this stuff or if this stuff owns me, as it takes up so much of my time and attention. There are certainly days when I spend more time in relationship to my material possessions than I do in relationship to God, or in relationship to nature or to other people. And on those days, I have to wonder, where is my allegiance? What is getting my attention? What is getting my allegiance? Tonight's scripture is one in which Jesus asks us to live in wholehearted allegiance to God. So I wonder, what would that look like for you? What would this wholehearted allegiance to God look like? What does it mean to give your allegiance to God, even when living in contexts that often pull at that allegiance? So what do you need to give it all to God? Do you need to give God time in prayer, listening to God? Do you need to give God your trust? Do you need to give God your actions, marching for justice, working for change? What is it? What is it that you need to give to God, and how will you do it? How might you lean out and rely on one another, rely on your church, rely on Jesus for support? In the end, the questioners of Jesus in tonight's scripture leave absolutely amazed. Jesus is not easily pinned down. Jesus is wise to their testing, and his first allegiance is to this all-encompassing scope of God's reign. And this, my friends, is the Jesus that we follow. We follow this Jesus who will not be boxed in or categorized. We follow this Jesus who points us to the larger truth that our allegiance is to God, to whom we belong. Amen.